What has prevented private sector from playing a considerable role in climate finance, and what have been some of the barriers for MSCs to invest in adaptation? And how can this change?
Okay, great. So the initial discussions on climate change did not bring on board the private sector, at least in the Ghanaian experience. They were not involved in the initial discourse around climate change, what the consequences are, and then the need for adaptation. So they came on board later when most of the discussions have been had. So they had to play a sort of catch-up role. But in that, we have not comprehensively addressed the bottom line concern for the private sector, which is mainly profit and then growth of the business. So we've talked about adaptation, heavily skewed towards the social impacts and the social consequences. The environmental bit has been very heavy, but very little evidence to support the economic imperatives for adaptation, which is what really matters to the private sector. So until we do that, provide compelling evidence backed by reliable and up-to-date data, scenario building to demonstrate to the businessman and the private sector that they stand to benefit on the long term if they adopt to the impact of climate change. The impact of climate change on their businesses, both in the short and long term, needs to be addressed. Then we have a good chance to bring on board the private sector. And one more thing is that, discussions on climate change and bringing in the private sector, sometimes the attention has also, or the focus has been on getting the private sector on board as a means or as part of their corporate social responsibility, doing something to help government achieve its goals, to let communities become more and more resilient, and we've not focused or addressed the primary needs of the private sector. What is the need for them, aside giving something back to society? What is the need for their businesses? And until we address that, we'll find it difficult to get private sector financing heavily on board. We'll get bits from private sector towards corporate social responsibilities, which is very much peanuts of what they can offer. But if they see the business case in it, then we can get the private sector on board heavily.
Okay. One other question. Considering that adaptation is quite difficult to quantify and measure, do you see that as a challenge for stimulating the private sector and catalyzing a certain change? You mentioned all the data and investing in the long term, but because I know mitigation is a lot easier, I would imagine, to get the private sector involved. So what can be done? And perhaps the fundamental issue is the fact that everything is run under the pretext of profit, ultimately, while it should be more of a humanitarian effort or on a more human level rather than the bottom line.
Well, that's right. It's the human interest, human well-being is important, but then we got to appreciate that there are different stakeholders with different priorities, and we cannot force priorities down the throat of various stakeholders. They are what they are. Private sector are what they are. Yes, they may have some human interest at heart, but primarily they are businesses, and they're looking at growing their business. They're looking at reaping a lot of benefit from the monies they put into various ventures. I agree with you. Quantifying the benefit or the impact of adaptation is quite tricky. It's a fairly complex thing to do, but we need to tell a compelling story. We might not have the full set of data to support it, but then we have enough anecdotal evidence that we can weave stories around to encourage the private sector to bring on board finances to support adaptation, especially how it would contribute to the long term to the growth and success of their businesses. I think there's still a lot we can do to attract a lot more private investment into adaptation.
Okay. One last question. Considering this and where Ghana is now, what in your opinion could be done to further the adaptation efforts, and more importantly, what information support would be useful for you?
we've done pretty much on adaptation, but I think one area we need support is bringing on board the various tools that have been developed, so we don't need to reinvent the wheel and then try scratching our head to do things. At this workshop, I've found out several tools that have been developed that we can easily use. So I think one area we need to Ghana needs to go is to find out these tools, build the capacity to be able to use these tools, and I'm more interested in building the capacity so that we can use the tools ourselves rather than relying on external parties to do it for us. And every time we need to go back to the external parties, if we build our capacities to use those tools, yeah, we can use it and even offer support to other African countries to use these tools in enhancing adaptation activities or interventions.
Perfect. Thank you very much.
Thank you.